Today we're going to continue to build on our understanding of fractions and decimals to identify some patterns and some ways that they are related, especially patterns when it comes to multiplying fractions and decimals. So if we had to convert each of these fractions to a decimal, we know that our decimal place values are, after the decimal place, we have our tenths, we have hundredths, we have thousandths, and then it keeps continuing on to 10,000ths, 100,000ths, millionths, and on and on and on, okay? But in order to convert this fraction 1/2 into a decimal, it will have to convert either to tenths or hundredths or thousandths, right? In this case, I can convert it easily to tenths just by multiplying by 5 on the bottom. And so whatever I do on the bottom, I need to do on the top, multiply by 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. So 5/10 is equivalent to 1/2. Once I have it in tenths, then I can write that as a decimal, because tenths is one of my place values, isn't it? One of my decimal place values. So 5/10 is the decimal 0.5. 5 in the tenths position. Okay, what about 1/4? Well, it won't work to make 1/4 into tenths because there's nothing I can multiply 4 by to equal 10. So in that case, I'm going to make it into hundredths because I know one of my place value locations in decimals is hundredths. Okay, what would I have to multiply the 4 by to get 100? 4 25s, right? Think of quarters, think of money. 4 25s is 100 cents, a dollar. Okay, so do the same thing on the top. Multiply 1 by 25, and I end up with 25 hundredths, which now I can write that as a decimal. That's 25 ending in the hundredths position, the second position after the decimal. Okay, what about 1/5? Well, again, I can make that into tenths just by multiplying denominator by 2. So multiply the numerator by 2. 2 tenths. And that's written as a decimal as 2 ending in the tenths place. Okay, what about 1/8? Well, I can't make it tenths because I can't multiply 8 by anything to equal 10 or 100, but I can make it thousandths because 8 will go into 1,000. What do I have to multiply 8 by to equal 1,000? Well, in my calculator, I can use 1,000 divided by 8, and it tells me that equals 125. So that means 8 times 125 equals 1,000. So same thing on the top, multiply by 125. Times 125 is 125. 125 thousandths, I would write that as a decimal with 125 ending in the thousandths position, the third place after the decimal. Okay? Okay, 1/10. Well, that's easy. It's already in tenths, which is one of my decimal place values. So I would write this as a decimal as 1/10. 1/20. Well, I can't change this to tenths because I could divide the bottom by 2, but I can't divide the top by 2. So my next easiest thing would be to convert this to hundredths because then I can write it as a decimal. So what have I multiplied 20 by to get 100? 20 times 5. So do the same thing on the top. 1 times 5 is 5. 5 hundredths written as a decimal. That's 5 ending in the hundredths position, the second place after the decimal. Okay, and then 1/25. Well, I can write that as hundredths. What have I multiplied my denominator by? 25 times 4. So on the top, 1 times 4, 4 hundredths. And I write that as a decimal with 4 ending in the hundredths position, the second place after the decimal. Okay, so whenever I am converting a fraction to a decimal, I need to convert it first to either tenths, hundredths, or thousandths, because those are my decimal positions, right? Okay, so if we have 3 people and they each eat 1/8 of a pizza, how much of the pizza did they eat all together? Well, right away when you see this keyword all together, that's telling you you're adding together how much each person ate to get a grand total. Okay, well, person 1 ate 1/8 of the pizza, the next person ate 1/8 of the pizza, the third person ate 1/8 of the pizza. So 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 is how many eighths? 3/8. Right. They ate 3/8 of the pizza altogether. So let's add these fractions then. 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. Well, how many fifths is that? It's 4 of them, isn't it? Okay, what about 1/7 plus 1/7 plus 1/7? How many sevenths is that? Well, it's 3/7, isn't it? 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10. How many tenths is that? That's 7 of them, 7/10. Okay, we're just using what we know about adding fractions, because if we have a common denominator, they're all tenths, then our answer is still tenths, isn't it? All we do is add the numerators as long as we have a common denominator. Okay, so again in D, we've got ninths. And how many ninths do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. 5 ninths. Now, as you can see, it would get pretty cumbersome to write 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 plus 1/10 7 times. So there has to be an easier way to write repeated addition when we're adding the same thing over and over and over again. And that is with multiplication, isn't it? Okay, so think about this for a minute. If I have 4 1/5, what we really have is 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5, right? We have 4 1/5s. And so you can see why that is 4/5, right? Okay, so it simplifies it, or makes it a lot easier to write when we can just say we have 4 1/5s, 4 groups of 1/5, okay? So let's use that then to solve some other problems. You can see here 3 1/7 or 3/7 would be 3/7, right? 7 1/10 would be 7/10. 5 1/9 would be 5/9. Okay? Really what you're doing is you're multiplying this number and this number, aren't you? And it's still tenths. Or you're multiplying 5 times 1 to get this number, and it's still ninths. Okay? So let's see if we can work backwards then. If we're given the fraction 3/5, can we write that as a whole number multiplied by a fraction that has a numerator of 1? In other words, can we write that as some number of 1/5? How many 1/5 would that be if it's 3/5? 3 1/5, right? Okay, what about this one? How many 7s would this be? If it's 2 7s, it will be 2 1/7. Okay, think about that for a minute. Okay, just let that sink in for a minute. This really means this one, 3 1/5 means you have 1/5 plus 1/5 plus 1/5. You've got 3 1/5, and that's why that is 3/5, right? 2 1/7 means you have 1/7 and another 1/7, which means you have 2 7s. Okay, so let's keep going and see if we can write 4 9ths the same way. Well, that means we would have 4 1s, 1 9ths, right? What about 3 10ths? That means we would have 3 1/10. Yeah. Okay, what about 8 15ths? That means we would have 8 1/15. Yes. 6/5. Ooh, now we're into some improper fractions. Does that change anything? No, still means we have 6 1/5. What about 8/3? Well, we have 8 1/3. Yeah. And what about 9? We have 9 1/4. Yeah, hopefully you were saying it before I said it, now that you see the pattern. Okay, so sometimes though, we've learned a couple of different ways that we can write a fraction, 4/5, as a decimal. Okay, a minute ago we said, well, if we have 4/5 and we want to write it as a decimal, I know I don't have any place value that is fifths, but I have tenths, hundredths, or thousands. So I can convert this to tenths pretty easily. By multiplying the denominator by 2 and the numerator by 2, I get 8/10, which I can write as a decimal like this. Okay, but I'm going to show you another way that you can use the pattern that we just discovered to write it as a multiplication fact. Okay, so 4/5 we know really is 4 1/5. Okay, well 1/5 is pretty easy to write as a decimal, because if you changed 1/5 to tenths, so you can write it as a decimal, 5 times 10 is, or 5 times what equals 10? Multiplying by 2. So you multiply the top by 2, you've got 2/10. And that's written like this, right? 2/10. So really we've got 4 2/10, which is easy to multiply, because remember you just multiply the leading numbers. So the 4 times 2, which gives you 8. And then your decimal, to know where the decimal goes, you say in my question here, how many digits were in the decimal places? Well, just this one, right? So you need 1 digit in the decimal places here. So that's why you would have 8 in the decimal places, and you'd have to put a 0.8 in front of it. Let's try a couple of those, see if you can figure this out. Okay, so we're going to convert more fractions to decimals using that method. Okay, so 3/5. What this really means is 3 1/5. Right, okay. So what this really means is I've got 3 whats. What is 1/5 written as a decimal? Well, fifths are not decimal places, but tenths are. So how many tenths would that be? Multiply by 2 in the denominator, multiply by 2 in the numerator. 2/10. 2/10 is written as a decimal, 0.2. Okay, now I can multiply. 3 times 2 is 6, but I have 1 digit in the decimal places here, so I need 1 digit in my answer in the decimal places. So that means I have to put the decimal there with a 0 in front. 0.6. Okay, let's try 5/2. Well, I know that means 5 halves. Okay, so let's see. This would be 5, and a half written as a decimal is 0.5. We probably know that already. We could figure it out, figuring out how many tenths that is. We've times on the bottom by 5, so we times on the top by 5, 5/10, and that's why it's written this way. Okay, so if we have 5 times 5/10, I got 5 times 5, that's 25. Now, where does my decimal go in that number? How many digits are in the decimal places in the question? Right here. I have 1 digit in the decimal places, so in my answer I need 1 digit in the decimal places, so my decimal has to go there then. 2.5. Alright, let's try 9/4. This really means I have 9 1/4. 9 quarters, in other words. Okay, so this means I have 9. Well, how do I write 1/4 as a decimal? Well, you can figure it out if you don't already know. So 1/4, can I write that as a tenth? No, because there's nothing I can multiply 4 by to get 10. Can I write it as 100? Because I have a hundredths position as well. Yes, I can. 4 times 25 on the bottom, so 1 times 25 on the top. 25 hundredths. How do I write that as a decimal? 0.25. 25 hundredths. Okay, now I have to multiply 9 times 0.25. Well, good thing I know how to multiply fractions because it's going to come in handy here. 0.25 times 9. Remember, when you multiply, it doesn't matter which order you multiply in. 9 times 0.25 or 0.25 times 9. Doesn't matter. In this case, I'm writing it with the 0.25 first and the 9 second, because then I only have to multiply all these digits by one number, the 9. Okay? So 9 times 5, 45, carry the 4. 9 times 2, 18, plus 4, 19, 20, 21, 22. Okay, now to figure out where my decimal goes, I look at how many decimal places do I have in the question. How many digits are in the decimal places? 1, 2. So the same has to be in my answer. 2 digits in the decimal places. That puts my decimal right there. 2.25 is my final answer. 9 times 0.25. Okay, and what about 7/20? Well, that's 7 groups of 1/20. Right. Okay, so this means 7 what's? What's 1/20th as a decimal? Well, 1/20th, I can't make it tenths, but I could make it a hundredths. Multiply 20 times 5 to get 100. So multiply the numerator also by 5. 1 times 5 is 5. That's 5 hundredths. How do I write 5 hundredths as a decimal? That's 5 ending in the hundredths place. 7 times 0.05. Well, this is easy. I just have 7 times 5, which is 35. But again, in my question, how many digits do I have in the decimal places? 1, 2. So in my answer, I have to have 1, 2. So that means my decimal would go there. I'm going to need a 0 in front. 0.35. All right, so let's calculate. 2 groups of a half, or 2 halves? Well, that's going to be 2 halves, which right away we should think, oh, well, if I have the same number in the numerator and the denominator, that's equal to 1 whole, right? Anytime you have a fraction with the same number on top and bottom, that's equal to 1. Okay, if you think of that in pictures, that means you have 2 halves. Well, there you go. You've got 2 halves, this half, and this half. I've got 1 whole, right? Okay, what about 3/3? Well, again, 3 groups of 1/3. That's 3/3. Again, I have a fraction with the same number in the numerator and the denominator. That's 1 whole, isn't it? If I think of that in a picture, here's my thirds. And if I've got 1/3 and another third and another third, I've got 1 whole, right? What about 4/4? Well, it's the same thing. That's the same number in the numerator and the denominator. That's equal to 1. Here's my picture. I've got a pie cut into fourths, and I've got all 4 of them. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. That's 1 whole pie. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. If I've got 5 1/5, I've got 5 fifths, which again is equal to having the whole pie. Here's my pie. It's split into 5 equal parts, and I've got 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, 5/5. I've got the whole pie. So anytime you have a fraction where your numerator is identical to your denominator, it's always, always, always equal to 1. All right. What if we had to add 1/4 plus 2/5? Well, we learned in our fractions unit that we can look for a common denominator, use equivalent fractions to make a common denominator, and then add them once we have a common denominator. Okay? But there is another way we could do that. We could use what we now know about decimals. So we're going to convert both fractions to decimals first. Okay? So let's think about 1/4 for a minute. Can I make that into tenths? Is there anything I can multiply 4 by that would equal 10? No. So I have to go hundredths then. Okay. 4 times 25. So do the same in the numerator. 1 times 25 is 25. So that's 25 hundredths. Okay. Plus, I'm just going to put this kind of in a section by itself so that my work doesn't get in the way. Okay, 2/5. I can make that into tenths pretty easily by multiplying by 2. So do the same in the numerator. 2 times 2, 4 tenths. Oops. Sorry. 4 tenths. Okay. So I'm going to convert those into decimals. That's pretty easy. 25 hundredths looks like this. 25 ending in the hundredths position. 4 tenths looks like this. And right away now I can add those pretty easily. Okay? So 0.25 plus 0.4, I can do that horizontally like this, or I can stack that up if it's easier to do it this way. The thing I have to remember about decimals is when you're adding, remember to line up your decimals, and when you do that, everything else will be lined up. Tenths with tenths, ones with ones, hundredths with hundredths. Okay? In this case, this number here has no hundredths, so it's just 5 plus nothing, 2 plus 4, bring down your decimal, 0 plus 0. So that's 0.65. In other words, 65 hundredths, which now I can convert that back to a fraction, which is 65 hundredths, right? Okay, now let's just see if we had done it the other way and just used what we know about fractions, if we would have got the same answer. Okay, so when we have 1/4 plus 2/5, we know that we can't add that if they have different denominators. It's called unlike denominators. So I'm going to need to look for a common denominator, a number that both 4 and 5 will go into. Well, I know 4 and 5 would both go into 20. So let's make these both 20s in the denominator. What have I multiplied 4 by to get 20? 4 times 5. So do the same in the numerator. 1 times 5, 5. So 5 20ths. And on the other side, what have I multiplied 5 by to get 20? Multiply by 4. So do the same in the numerator. 2 times 4, 8. So this is 13 20ths. Okay. The problem is, I can't write that as a decimal because I don't have a decimal position that is 20ths. But I can make that hundredths because I do have a decimal position that is hundredths. What do I have to multiply this 20 by to get 100? Multiply by 5. So on the top, multiply by 5. We'll just do that over here. 13 times 5. 5 times 3 is 15. Carry the 1. 5 times 1 is 5. Plus 1 is 6. 65 hundredths. Oh, well, look at that. 65 hundredths written as a decimal. That's the exact same answer I got down here, isn't it? Okay, so there are a few different ways that you can look at a question like this. You can convert it to decimals, add it together, and then convert it back into a fraction, or you can use what you know about equivalent fractions and adding fractions and get it that way as well. Okay, and that's the end of our lesson for today.